Subtle ambient music, a bamboo flute, wind brushing through trees, bird song echoing softly. The screen is dark, then fades into a forest bathed in early morning light. Narrator, calm, present, slightly solemn tone. What if I told you that always being available to others might be the very reason you feel so unavailable to yourself? There is no fire like passion, no shark like hatred, no snare like folly, and no torrent like craving. The Dhammapada. Are you tired of saying yes out of guilt? Have you been quietly disappearing behind your kindness? Do you ever wonder what it would feel like to come home to yourself? If so, this reflection was made for you. Welcome, dear soul, to Mindful Footsteps, a place for those who are ready to stop chasing and start remembering. This is not just a video. This is a pause, a doorway, an invitation back to your inner temple. Here, we walk slowly. We listen deeply. We remember what the world taught us to forget. So if this message stirs something in you, let it unfold. Stay with us. And if it touches you, I invite you to comment, share, or subscribe, not for the sake of numbers, but to keep this space alive for every soul who longs for peace. Let's begin. Part 1. The hidden weight of constant availability. There is a quiet kind of suffering that goes unnoticed in this world. It doesn't scream. It doesn't show up in medical charts. And it doesn't ask for sympathy. But it weaves itself silently through our days. In every text replied to out of guilt. In every favor accepted out of obligation. In every moment we say yes when our soul is whispering please, not today. We live in a culture that silently worships availability. The faster you reply, the more virtuous you seem. The more accessible you are, the more worthy you're perceived. But let me ask you gently, what happens when the one who is always there for everyone suddenly needs someone and no one is left? A life given away, piece by piece. When I was much younger in my practice, I met a woman known in her community as Grandmother Lotus. She was in her 70s, a widow, and her home was always open, her kettle always hot, her voice always soft, her presence always there. She was the one people called when their hearts were breaking. She was the one they sought when there was chaos in the family. She listened, she comforted, she gave again and again and again. But one afternoon, I found her sitting alone at her table, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Her gaze was somewhere far away. She said to me, "I gave so much of myself. I forgot who I was without someone else to save." That sentence has echoed in my heart for years. And I wonder, how many of us are living lives we didn't choose, just to hold together lives that are falling apart around us? How many of us confuse being constantly needed with being deeply loved? The cultural addiction to being good. We've been conditioned since childhood to equate goodness with selflessness. Be nice, don't cause trouble, put others first, be there for your family, don't say no. These teachings were meant to shape us into kind human beings. But somewhere along the path, we misheard the message. We started believing that we only matter when we're helping others, that the more we sacrifice, the more worthy we become, that to be loved, we must be useful. But the Buddha said, you yourself, as much as anyone in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. So let me ask you something now, heart to heart. When was the last time you gave yourself the love you so easily give to others? Not self-care, not a massage or a walk in the park, I mean the radical love of not needing to prove your worth through service. The love that lets you rest without apology. The love that whispers, "You are enough," even when you are not available. The illusion of importance, constant availability, can feel like power. It makes us feel seen, needed, included. But if we're honest, how often is that need actually respect? How often are we loved for who we are, not for what we provide? The truth is, being needed is not the same as being valued. And for many people, especially as they age, this distinction becomes painfully clear. Look at some of the most respected people in the world: leaders, innovators, artists. Barack Obama, in his memoir, A Promised Land, reflected on how stepping away from the demands of constant visibility allowed him to hear his own voice again. He wasn't just Mr. President. He was a human being who needed space to breathe. Even the powerful must retreat, or they burn. So what makes us think we are any different? The spiritual trap of overgiving. In Buddhist thought, the clinging to identity, even to a good identity, is still clinging. It's still suffering. You can be addicted to helping. You can be attached to being the rescuer. And ironically, this attachment often masks our own fear, the fear of being forgotten if we stop showing up. But dear listener, let me offer you this. If someone loves you only when you're useful, do they really love you at all? We must be willing to see through the illusion. You are not your usefulness. You are not your availability. You are not a machine to be plugged into every time someone else feels lost. You are a sacred being. The subtle violence of self-abandonment. Each time we say yes when we mean no, each time we silence our fatigue just to keep the peace, each time we give away the only free hour we had for ourselves, we abandon something holy. And slowly, piece by piece, that abandonment becomes a way of life. You wake up one day and find your favorite books unread, your dreams unfollowed, your hobbies untouched, and your body weary in a way sleep cannot heal. Let me ask you now, with love, when did you last hear your own voice, unfiltered by guilt, unburdened by duty? What does your soul sound like when no one else is speaking into your life? If you can't answer that, you may have been gone from yourself for too long. The sacred pause. There is no blame here, only awakening. The first step to liberation is not grand or dramatic. It begins in a moment, a pause. In that pause, we begin to question, who am I when I'm not saving someone? What do I need that I haven't dared to ask for? Can I still love others deeply without abandoning myself? This is not selfishness. This is the seed of self-awareness. And from that seed, peace begins to grow. Reflection and connection. Have you ever felt invisible behind your endless yeses? Have you confused being needed with being loved? When was the last time you chose yourself first, and how did it feel? If these questions stir something in you, allow that feeling to sit with you for a while. Let your response be gentle. You don't owe the world your constant presence. Sometimes, the most sacred thing you can offer is your own return to yourself. Part 2. The sacred power of saying no. In Buddhist teaching, the root of suffering is craving, not just for material things, but for approval, acceptance, and significance. We crave to be needed. We fear being seen as selfish, and so we keep saying yes long after we've run out of energy to give. I once sat with a man in his 60s, a father, a husband, a caretaker. He looked at me, weary, and said, "I haven't sat quietly with myself in over 30 years. He wasn't complaining. He was just lost. We often believe that kindness must come with self-sacrifice, but metta, loving kindness, begins within. You cannot pour from an empty cup. There's a Zen parable of a monk who drinks only half a cup of tea each morning, then pours the rest away. When asked why, he said, "I give only what I've truly savored." I met a retired nurse who had cared for her family, her patients, her community. One day, she declined a neighbor's request, not out of anger, but from fatigue. The woman never spoke to her again, and yet in that silence, something sacred returned: peace. Don't give your energy away before you've had time to live inside it. Saying no is not rejection, it's the beginning of truth. When was the last time you said no and meant it? And what would it feel like if you allowed yourself that permission today? Part 3. Withdrawal is not weakness, it is wisdom. In our culture, withdrawal is often misunderstood. It's seen as giving up, shutting down, or being cold. But in the spiritual path, withdrawal is not weakness, it's clarity. It's the conscious choice to step back so the truth can step forward. In Buddhist teachings, this is known as noble silence, the mindful restraint from unnecessary speech and reaction. It's not about being quiet because you're scared. It's about being quiet because you've heard enough. I remember visiting an elderly monk who lived in a small hut deep in the forest. He rarely spoke unless there was real need. When asked why, he smiled and said, "The louder the world becomes, the more I must listen within." His silence wasn't emptiness, it was presence. Today, we're taught to be reactive, to answer quickly, to prove we're involved. But have you ever noticed how much energy we waste explaining ourselves to people who aren't listening? Withdrawal gives us that energy back. It creates space. Space to breathe, to observe, to reset. A woman in her late 60s once told me she stopped answering her phone after 6 p.m. She called it her evening vow. At first, people were offended. Some even accused her of being distant. But in that stillness, she began to sleep better. She returned to painting. She started to hear her own thoughts again. What she learned is something most of us forget. You do not need to be accessible to be loving. You do not need to be reactive to be present. Sometimes stepping back is not leaving, it's leading from within. Let me ask you this. Where in your life are you overstaying your peace? What would happen if you pulled back, not in anger, but in wisdom? Part 4. Boundaries are acts of compassion. Many people fear that boundaries are cold, unkind, or even selfish. But in truth, boundaries are not walls that shut others out. They are gates, designed to protect what is sacred within. A woman in her 60s once told me she had never refused a request from her adult children. Not once. She feared being seen as unloving or unreliable. But after years of quiet exhaustion, she finally said, "Not this time," when her son asked for another loan. And something surprising happened. He didn't get angry. He didn't leave. He paused. And for the first time, he saw her, not just as a provider, but as a full human being. He saw her limits. He saw her needs. He saw her dignity. That moment became a turning point, not just in their relationship, but in how she saw herself. Boundaries are not rejections. They are invitations to love each other with awareness. The Buddha once asked, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" So too with anger. So too with guilt. So too with manipulation. You do not have to accept every emotion handed to you. You do not have to carry what was never yours. I once met a retired school principal who said yes to every request, substitute teaching, organizing community events, even babysitting grandchildren every weekend. She said, "People loved me when I was useful, but I didn't know if they loved me when I said no." So she tried it. She declined an invitation. She let someone else lead. She allowed herself a quiet weekend for the first time in years. And when Monday came, the world hadn't collapsed. Her value had not vanished. She was still loved, but now, more honestly. A boundary, spoken with calm and care, is not a barrier. It is a blessing. So let me ask you, where in your life do you need to say no? Not to close a door, but to open your own? Part 5. Recognizing emotional manipulation. Manipulation doesn't always raise its voice. Often it speaks in gentle tones, wrapped in affection. "You're the only one I can count on. I guess I just thought you cared more." At first glance, it sounds like love. It sounds like trust. But beneath the surface, something else is at work, control disguised as closeness. One retired man I spoke with, a father of 3 grown children, shared this with quiet regret. "I thought I was helping my family by saying yes to everything, but in the end, I realized I was just protecting them from growing up." That's not compassion. That's avoidance. And though it may come from love, it can quickly become a pattern where one person gives endlessly while others never learn responsibility. True compassion means allowing others to face their own discomfort, their own growth, their own life, even when it's hard to watch. There's a moment when we begin to set boundaries, firmly but gently, and those who've come to rely on our silence, our guilt, or our exhaustion begin to push back. They may act confused. They may say, "You've changed." And they're right, because something sacred has shifted. The pattern is breaking. The spell of emotional dependency is dissolving. I once knew a woman who had spent decades being the emotional caretaker of her siblings. Every crisis came through her phone. Every meltdown landed at her feet. And the first time she said, "I'm sorry, I can't talk right now," her sister called her cold, selfish. But do you know what happened next? Nothing fell apart, and she finally had space to breathe. You are not unkind for refusing to carry what someone else refuses to put down. You're not cruel for letting others feel the consequences of their own choices. So let me ask you, is there someone in your life who uses love as leverage? And what would it look like to step out of that cycle with gentleness, but with strength? Because when you stop participating in manipulation, you don't just protect your peace, you invite others to discover theirs. Part 6. Choosing silence over reaction. There is a strength in silence that few recognize. In a world obsessed with opinions, replies, and instant reactions, silence can seem uncomfortable, even threatening. But in the spiritual path, silence is not weakness, it is mastery. It is clarity in motion. A Zen master once told his student, "If someone leaves a gift at your door and you do not pick it up, who owns the gift?" The student replied, "The giver." The master nodded. "Exactly. So it is with insult. You are not obligated to accept what was never yours. Not every criticism deserves an explanation. Not every misunderstanding requires your defense. True silence is not passive. It is protective. It is the sacred pause that guards your peace. I once spoke with a woman who had just turned 70. She told me that for most of her life, she would argue when she felt misunderstood. She felt compelled to clarify, to fix, to prove. But one day, In the middle of a conversation that turned tense, she simply stopped. She didn't explain. She didn't react. She just breathed and let it be. Later, she told me, that was the first time I didn't betray myself to be understood. In that space between emotion and reaction, something extraordinary happened. She met her truest self. You see, silence is not about pretending that nothing happened. It's about trusting that not everything needs your participation. It's an act of trust in yourself, in the moment, in the unfolding of life. So let me ask you, when was the last time you chose silence over defense? What would happen if you stopped proving and simply stood in your presence? Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Part 7. The loneliness that liberates. There is a certain hour, often in the quiet stretch of evening, when the world seems to pause. The phone no longer rings. The dishes are done. The soft hum of the day fades into stillness. And in that silence, many people feel it, that gentle ache we call loneliness. But what if that ache wasn't something to fear? What if it was something sacred? In Buddhist tradition, there is a word for this kind of solitude, viveka, noble aloneness. It is not isolation. It is not abandonment. It is the presence of self, unclouded by performance or distraction. I once knew a woman who, after decades of caregiving, moved into a small cottage by the sea. She told me, "The first month, I cried every night. I wasn't used to hearing nothing but myself, but slowly something changed." She said, "The silence stopped feeling empty. It started to feel full of breath, full of thought, full of me." This is not disconnection. This is remembrance. When we are constantly surrounded by noise, even the voices of those we love, we begin to forget the texture of our own soul. Solitude is the space where we remember. But yes, it can be uncomfortable at first, because in the quiet, we meet all that we've ignored: regret, longing, desire, unlived dreams, and yet also grace. Because beyond the ache lies something deeper, a homecoming, not to a place, but to yourself. Let me ask you this. Have you ever sat in silence long enough to hear your own spirit speak? Not your thoughts, not your fears, but the quiet truth beneath them? Because perhaps what we call loneliness is simply life inviting us back into intimacy with our breath, our being, and our becoming. Part 8. Emotional sovereignty, a return to your inner temple. After 60, something begins to shift, not from rebellion, not from bitterness, but from clarity. You begin to feel it, a quiet knowing that rises from within. This is your time, not to escape others, but to come home to yourself. I once spoke with a retired nurse, a mother of 3. She said to me, "I used to feel guilty if I didn't reply right away to my daughter's texts. Then I remembered, I'm her mother, not her emergency line." There was no anger in her voice, just clarity. She had found her center again. This is what we call emotional sovereignty, the ability to remain present without being pulled in every direction. To love deeply, but not lose yourself. To care sincerely, but not at the expense of your inner peace. You no longer speak from guilt. You speak from grounded wisdom. You no longer give to feel worthy. You give because you already know your worth. This isn't distance, it's discernment. The Buddha said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." And the older we become, the more sacred those words feel. There comes a time when you no longer feel the need to explain every boundary, to soften every no, to apologize for resting. Not because you care less, but because you've finally learned to care for yourself too. So let me ask you, Where in your life have you confused urgency with importance? Where have you mistaken constant response for love? You are not here to be available to everyone at all times. You are here to be authentic, whole, and at peace. And that peace begins the moment you stop seeking permission to protect it. Conclusion: returning to the inner temple. And so we arrive, not at the end but at the quiet beginning of something deeper. Perhaps nothing around you has changed, but something within you has. A shift, a remembering. The world may call you distant. Let it. They may say you've changed. Smile gently, because you have. You are no longer living to be needed. You are living to be whole. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." Sometimes that word is no. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's the soft sound of your own footsteps as you walk away from what is expected and return to what is sacred. Your presence is no longer a currency for approval. It is a homecoming. If something within you stirred, if a breath felt a little deeper, or a memory returned with new meaning, I invite you to leave a simple reflection in the comments. I choose peace. Let it be your quiet vow, a small but powerful declaration that your energy, your time, your being are no longer up for negotiation. You are not fading. You are arriving, fully, finally, for yourself. And if this message spoke to your spirit, share it with someone who's still giving themselves away without realizing it. And subscribe to Mindful Footsteps. Not to follow another channel, but to return again and again to the stillness that reminds you who you really are. We'll be here, walking slowly, breathing deeply, and waiting, without rush, for you. Until next time, be still, be whole, and may your peace be louder than the world around you.